Hello and welcome to this video lesson on the National 5 biology topic, ecosystems. We are now starting Unit 3, Life on Earth, and this is KA1, ecosystems. Once again, here's the SQA course specification or mandatory knowledge section for this topic. Remember, this is all the bits of knowledge and content that you could be tested on in a test or exam at this level for this topic. Although this looks like quite a short topic, this topic has the most definitions of all the National 5 key areas. So I'm going to break this down into smaller sections so that we can understand it properly. As we go through the theory for each section, there will be some questions after each part so that you can be sure you're ready to move on. However, I would also suggest after I say each definition that you pause the video and repeat it out loud a few times, as will help you begin to remember them. So our learning intention for this part is to learn about ecosystems, and hopefully by the end of this lesson you'll be able to give the definitions of terms related to ecosystems, describe what a niche is, interpret and construct food chains and food webs, and explain the differences between the two types of competition. So first of all, we're going to look at the main set of definitions of ecological terms that you must understand and know for this topic. Our first term is ecosystem. Ecosystem is a word you've probably heard of before, but you must know that the definition of an ecosystem is that it consists of all the organisms, or the community, living in a particular habitat and the non-living components with which the organism interacts. So if you're looking out for this definition and a list of others from this topic, look out for living and non-living parts or components, although you should know the whole thing off by heart by that point. You must also know that an ecosystem is composed of many habitats and communities. So what we're going to do is we're now going to look at both of these words in turn to learn their definitions. So a habitat is a place where an organism lives, and you can see examples here of various places where organisms might live. Here we have an ocean, a forest, and a desert. Now these are all different habitats with different climates and characteristics, and therefore they'll have different organisms living within them. So ecosystems are made up of both the habitats, the places where the organisms live, and their communities. Now a community is a word we use to describe all of the organisms that live within a habitat. So no matter what the species is, as long as it's in the habitat, it is part of the community. So in these pictures, I have shown examples of 3 different communities. So community 1, you would find in the ocean. These are different types of animals you'll find in the ocean, that community. Community 2, you'd find in a desert habitat, and community 3, you would find in a forest. So together, these communities and their habitats make up their different ecosystems. Now, 2 terms a lot of people tend to confuse are populations and communities. Whilst we've just covered communities, so all of the organisms that live within a habitat, a population is a group of living things of the same species. So for example, in an ocean habitat, you might have a community of organisms made up of hundreds of different species of living things. There might be crabs, whales, fish, coral, and lots of other organisms of different species, and these would be a community. However, you could also count the population of a particular species in that habitat. So for example, a shoal of cod within the ocean habitat would be a population, as it's a group of living things of the same species, so only one species. And I've got some examples here, including a herd of sheep and a flock of crows. They are populations, they're not communities, because they're only made up of a group of the same species. So a population is a group of living things of the same species, and a community is made up of all of the organisms in different species that live within a habitat. Now, I've mentioned the word species a few times now. You may think you already know what a species is, however, there's a very particular definition that you need to give. We covered species back when we did variation and inheritance in Unit 2, but just to give you a reminder, a species is a group of organisms which can interbreed to produce fertile offspring. You must use this definition, you must use the word interbreed, and you have to say fertile offspring as well. So here we have a few wee reminders about species. Here we have 2 humans, and when they interbreed, they create a baby human, which is fertile and can go on and have its own offspring, which means the parents were both the same species, so humans in this case. In this example here, we have a male lion interbreeding with a female lion to produce a lion cub, and this lion cub is a fertile offspring and can go on to have its own offspring, so these lions were the same species. Now, so far those were quite easy examples. Let's try a little bit of a harder one now. This example tries to highlight where some people might get confused. Specifically, some people think of a species as just being a group of organisms that look the same. However, here we have a Labrador and a poodle. They don't really look the same, but when you interbreed them together, they produce a Labradoodle puppy, and this Labradoodle puppy is fertile and can go on and have its own offspring. So that means that both of the parents, both the Labrador and the poodle, are the same species. They're both dogs. So one thing to remember here is that these are different dog breeds, and breeds are not the same thing as a species. Otherwise, if we tried to interbreed these two dogs together, they wouldn't be able to interbreed, or they would have produced an offspring that was infertile and couldn't produce its own offspring. So here's an example of that happening. In this example, we're crossing a male horse with a female donkey, and this produces a mule. So although they could interbreed together, the mule they produce is infertile, and this means that the horse and the donkey are not the same species, as they couldn't produce fertile offspring. Here are some more examples of that in action. So some species are closely related enough to one another, like the horse and the donkey, that they can interbreed to produce offspring. So that first part of our species definition. However, those offspring are not fertile, so the parents are not the same species. On the left here, we have a liger, which results from the cross between a lion and a tiger, which is infertile as the parents were both different species. A zonkey is a result of a zebra and a donkey cross, and a zorse, which is the result of inbreeding a zebra and a horse. All of these examples show the parents were not the same species, as they didn't interbreed to produce fertile offspring. The next definition that you need to know for this topic is biodiversity. It's quite easy to remember this definition if you split the word. So bio means living and diversity means variety. So biodiversity is the variety of living things in an ecosystem, or the number of different living things in an ecosystem. Here on the left, you can see an ecosystem, the ocean, which is a high biodiversity. So it supports a wide variety of living things, whereas if we compare it to the desert ecosystem on the right, you can see that very few living things live here. So the desert can be said to have a low biodiversity, as it has a low variety or number of different living things. Our final couple of definitions before we try our first set of questions is the difference between predators and prey. Now, if I gave you two animals, like the cheetah and the gazelle here, and asked you to name which was a predator and which was the prey, you would probably be able to do that quite easily. However, it's more difficult to explain the definition if asked. So a predator is an animal which hunts and kills other animals, or prey, for food, like this cheetah in the example. Whereas a prey is an organism which is hunted and killed by a predator. So in this case, the gazelle is a prey as it's being hunted and killed by the predator, the cheetah in this example. So let's try some quick questions on what we've covered so far to check our knowledge before we move on. So pause the video here and try these questions, either by saying the answer out loud or writing them down. And when you're ready, play the video and we'll go through the answers. Number 1 asked us to give the definition of the following terms. So ecosystem is the first one, so the one that the topic is named after. So this consists of all the organisms, or the community, living in a particular habitat, and the non-living components with which the organisms interact. It's a really long definition, but it's an extremely important one because that is the topic that we're on. Community is a community that consists of all the organisms that live within a habitat. So remember, this is not just the one species, this is all of the organisms. Population, on the other hand, is a group of living things of the same species. And I've kept the examples there, but you don't need those in the definition. Habitat is the place where an organism lives. And species, so our one that we did in variation and inheritance, is a group of organisms that can interbreed to produce fertile offspring. The second question asked to explain the difference between predator and prey. So predator is an animal which hunts and kills for food, whereas prey is an animal which is hunted and killed for food by the predator. So now let's have a look at food chains. So food chains are diagrams like this one on the slide, which show a simple feeding relationship between organisms. So in this example, the rabbit eats the grass and the hawk eats the rabbit. The arrows in a food chain are very, very important. In this example, you can see all of the arrows are going towards the right of the screen. And this is basically, so they basically don't show who eats who, instead they represent the direction of energy flow. So grass contains energy, which is consumed by the rabbit. So the energy flows from the grass into the rabbit. And then when the rabbit is eaten by the hawk, the energy flows from the rabbit into the hawk. So remember, the arrows in a food chain represent the direction of energy flow. Be careful not to put them in the wrong direction. If I reverse the arrows here, it would be incorrect, as then it would mean that the energy from the rabbit would be going into the grass and not the other way around. So a quick way to remember is it's whatever is eating the next one it goes into, but it's the direction of energy flow. If you get asked the energy from the grass, it's going into the rabbit. Energy from the rabbit is going into the hawk when they get eaten. Now, in this topic, you'll get asked a lot of questions about food chains. Specifically, a common question that is asked is for you to identify the different types of organisms from a food chain. Our first example is being asked about the producer. So a producer is an organism which produces its own food. This is through photosynthesis, which we complete a whole topic on later in this unit. So photosynthesis takes place normally in green plants, and these are always found at the start of a food chain as they make their own food and therefore don't have to consume any other organism to get their energy or their food. So in this example, the producer is the grass because it produces its own food and therefore it does not have to consume it from anything else. The opposite of a producer is a consumer. A consumer is an organism which consumes other organisms for food. Essentially, consumers are anything in a food chain that isn't a green plant. In this example, both the rabbit and the hawk are consumers as they have to consume other organisms. So the rabbit has to eat the grass and the hawk has to eat the rabbit to gain food. Because the rabbit is the first consumer in the food chain, as the grass is a producer, so we don't count that, then we call the rabbit a primary consumer. Because the hawk is the second consumer in the food chain, we call it the secondary consumer. So here we have the producer, grass, which produces its own food, the primary consumer, which is the rabbit, as it consumes the grass for food, and then we have the secondary consumer, the hawk, as it consumes the rabbit for food. So if you're looking at a food chain, it always goes producer, primary consumer, secondary consumer, and then you sometimes do have tertiary or quaternary consumers, but usually it stops at secondary or tertiary. There are three groups that we can put consumers into, depending on what they consume. There are herbivores, carnivores, and omnivores. Hopefully you're already familiar with these, but if you're asked to define them, then you should say that a herbivore is an organism which only consumes plant matter. A carnivore is an organism which only consumes animal matter. And an omnivore is an organism which consumes both plant and animal matter. Here down the side, you can see some examples. So a koala is a herbivore as it only consumes plant matter. Lion is a carnivore as it only consumes animal matter, and a gorilla is an omnivore like us as it consumes both plant and animal matter. So if I edit our previous food chain, you can now see the terms I compare with each organism. So the grass on the left is a producer as it makes its own food through photosynthesis. The rabbit consumes the grass, so is the primary consumer, and because it only eats plant material, it can also be referred to as a herbivore. The hawk consumes the rabbit, so it's a secondary consumer, and because it only eats animal material, it can be referred to as a carnivore. Now, this food chain is very, very simple. It only consists of 3 organisms, and it suggests that each organism only consumes one other species or type of organism. So this looks like the hawk only eats rabbits, and the rabbits only eat grass. So after we try the next few questions, we'll look at food webs, which are a lot more realistic. So let's try some quick questions on what we've covered so far to check our knowledge before we move on. So pause the video here and try these questions, either by saying the answer out loud or writing them down. And when you're ready, play the video and we'll go through the answers. So the first question asks, the diagram shows a simple food chain for an oak wood. It has an oak tree, then a caterpillar, bluebird, and then a sparrowhawk. Name the following from the food chain. So the producer always comes at the start of a food chain. So here we can see it's the oak tree. A primary consumer, well, the primary consumer consumes the producer, so that's the caterpillar. There's only one example here of that. And a carnivore can either be the bluebird or the sparrowhawk, and that's because the bluebird consumes the caterpillar, the sparrowhawk consumes the bluebird. Both of them eat animal matter, so it means that it can be either of these. So as I mentioned before, food chains only show very simple feeding relationships between organisms. Food webs are diagrams which show all of the feeding relationships in an ecosystem, like this example here. Again, the arrows in a food web represent the direction of energy flow and not who eats who. So we are going to use this food web example to detail the various types of questions that normally get asked in tests and exams on this topic. Firstly, questions often ask which organism or organisms consume another named organism. For example, if I asked what organism or organisms consume the snake, I would look at my diagram and I would answer either owl or hawk. If I was asked which organism or organisms consume grass, I would answer caterpillar, rabbit, or grasshopper. Another common type of question is where you get asked to identify whether an organism is a producer, primary consumer, secondary consumer, or tertiary consumer. So I'm going to detail how you would work this out just now. So firstly, I'm going to highlight our producer down here in yellow. So remember, there could be more than one producer in a food web, so do look out for that. But in this example, there's only one. So remember, a producer is the organism that doesn't consume any other organisms, as it can produce its own food, and it'll be the start of any food chain in the food web. So my producer here is grass, and I can tell that because there are no arrows going towards it. They're all going away from it. So grass is one of my producers. Next, I want to highlight the primary consumers in red. So the primary consumers are the ones next up in the level of the food chain that consume the producer, the grass. So by following the arrows from my producer, the grass, I can see the three organisms that consume the grass directly are caterpillars, the rabbit, and the grasshopper. So all three of these are primary consumers. Next, I want to highlight the secondary consumers in green. So secondary consumers consume the primary consumers. So the three I highlighted in my previous diagram in red. They also come third if you work your way from the producer, the grass, down a food chain. So here I have two secondary consumers in this food web. I have the snake and the hawk. So I can go grass, rabbit, hawk. So that's producer, primary consumer, secondary consumer. And I can do the same thing with the snake up this way. Finally, if a question was trying to be difficult, it might ask you to highlight the organism, which is a tertiary consumer, or organisms. Tertiary just means third. Now, it was quite obvious that the owl was a tertiary consumer from the definition. As you can see, the chain goes grass, producer, caterpillar, which is the primary consumer, snake, which is the secondary consumer, and then owl, which is the tertiary consumer. However, what you might not have spotted was that the hawk can either be a secondary consumer or a tertiary consumer, depending on which chain you look at. So if we look at the grass, rabbit and then hawk would be the tertiary consumer, as it consumes the secondary consumer in the chain, snake. So basically we have here producer, primary consumer, secondary consumer, but we also have grass, caterpillar, snake. So that would be producer, primary, secondary, tertiary. So that's why the hawk can be either secondary if it's in this food chain, or it can be tertiary if we're looking at this one. The most common question that's often asked about food webs is where they ask you to determine the effect on another organism if a particular organism is removed from that web. So for example, if you were told, following an outbreak of disease, all of the rabbit population die, predict how the population of hawks might be affected. Firstly, the word predict means that you should be answering with either increase, decrease, or stay the same. If this question instead said what would be the effect of, then again, they're looking for the same type of answer. So let's look at what would happen. What I would suggest to do for a question like this is to use your hand to cover up the species which has died or been reduced in number. So here I've crossed out the rabbit instead. So what we have to do is look at how the rabbits are connected to the hawks, because that's what they're asking about in the question. Well, the hawks eat the rabbit, so if the rabbits die out, the hawk's going to have less food and the hawk population will decrease. So my answer is decrease, and if they ask for an explanation, I can say because the hawks normally eat rabbits and therefore they will have less food. I should not say that they'll have no food, as we can see that hawks also eat snakes and they won't be affected by the rabbit population disappearing. So I'll just say that the hawks will decrease because they have less food. Let's try another question. Again, following an outbreak of disease, all of the rabbits die, but now I need to predict how the population of caterpillars would be affected. Well, looking at my diagram, this might not be completely obvious at first, as rabbits and caterpillars are not directly connected to one another, but both of them do eat grass. So the rabbits die out, then there would be more grass because the rabbits aren't there to eat it. Therefore, the caterpillars will have more to eat and their population would therefore increase. So I can say increase, and for that reasoning. So now what we're going to do is we're going to run through some quick questions on food webs to check our knowledge before we move on. I'm going to do each question one at a time with the answers straight after. So remember to pause the video after each question I've read out and try them either by saying them out loud or writing them down. And when you're ready for each answer, play the video and we'll go through it. The first question is looking at this new food web up on the right hand side, and it asks to name the producer or producers. So pause the video here to try this and then hit play when you're ready for the answer. So we're looking for the producers, the organisms that produce their own food and don't consume any other organism, and therefore they are at the start of the food chain in a food web. So the answers that I could have here are seaweed, or I could have plant plankton. Both would be perfect. Question number 2 asks you to pause the video here and name the primary consumer or consumers. So the primary consumers are those which directly eat the producer. So the answers would be crab, because it eats the seaweed here, and then krill and animal plankton because they eat the plant plankton. So crab, animal plankton and krill are your 3 answers for that. Question number 3 asks you to pause the video here and name the secondary consumer or consumers from that web. So the secondary consumers consume the primary consumers, so they would be the fish, they would be the blue whale, and then they would also be the squid. Question number 4 asks you to pause the video and name 2 tertiary consumers from this food web. So tertiary consumers consume the secondary consumers and are the 4th organism in a food chain. So you can say any 2 here from elephant seal, penguin and leopard seal. And I'll just show you one of these in an example. So if I'm looking for the tertiary consumer, this is a producer, primary consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary consumer, and that's how I get elephant seal. If I was looking for penguin, it would be producer, primary consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary consumer. Question number 5 asks you to draw a food chain from the food web which is made up of 5 organisms in total. So try and pause the video here and try and draw that out. So here you can give any acceptable answer. Now some examples would be, I'll just point some of these out, so seaweed, crab, squid, elephant seal, orca. That has 5 and it stops there. You could also have had seaweed, crab, squid, penguin, orca, seaweed, crab, squid, penguin, leopard seal, plant plankton, shrill, fish, leopard seal, orca, or plant plankton, animal plankton, fish, leopard seal, orca. I think that's all of the food chains with 5, but there could be one I've missed out. So as long as they are all joined in a chain and there's only 5 organisms, you would get the mark. Question 6 asks you to pause the video and describe how squid are dependent on seaweed. So the answer to number 6 needs both parts. You must say that the squid eats the crab and the crab eats the seaweed. So you have to have both of those parts there. Squid eats the crab eats the seaweed. Finally, question 7 asks, following an outbreak of disease, all of the fish die. Predict the effect this has on orcas and give an explanation why. So for answer 7, it's that the orca population would decrease because without fish, the leopard seals would have less food, so their population would decrease as well. And this would mean the orcas would therefore have less food as they normally eat the leopard seals. Okay, so now we've covered lots of basic ecosystems definitions and we've looked at both food chains and food webs. Now we're going to look at one really important definition. So now we're going to look at what a niche is. So a niche is the role that an organism plays within a community. So remember, a community consists of all the organisms that live within a habitat. So a niche is the role that a particular organism plays within that community. This niche includes the resources that organisms require within its ecosystem, for example, the light or nutrients that are available for it. It also includes its interactions with other organisms in the community. Specifically, the organisms may be involved in competition with other organisms, which we'll discuss in more detail soon, or it might be involved in predation. It could either be a predator or a prey. Finally, a niche includes the conditions the organism can tolerate, such as temperature. So when we consider an organism's niche, we need to think about things like what does it feed on, what feeds on it, what resources does it compete for, and many other factors. So here is one example of an organism's niche, or the role it plays within its community. This example is about the barn owl here on the right. So barn owls can only live in areas with certain temperatures. For example, they can't live in the poles as it's too cold for them. They come out at night to hunt, so they are a predator, and they prey on voles, mice, and rats for food. They live in hollows found in trees, caves, or cliffs, so these must be present in their habitat. However, barn owls also aren't just predators, they are also prey for larger birds such as buzzards. Barn owls also have to compete with other owl species for food, as they also hunt small mammals like voles, mice, and rats. So all of these things I've just described makes up a barn owl's niche, so the role that the organism plays within its community. So our last part of our topic is about competition. Competition in ecosystems is really common and happens when resources are in short supply. For example, if there's not a lot of light in a forest, different plants will compete to try and reach it. If there is a shortage of mates, lions may compete with one another for those mates. If there's not a lot of nuts left on some trees for food, squirrels might compete with each other as well. In all of these cases, competition only happens if the resources are in short supply. If there was lots of light or mates or nuts in those examples I mentioned, then there would be enough to go around and competition wouldn't take place. Competition can be split up into two types, and they sound very similar, but you cannot mix them up. They are called interspecific competition and intraspecific competition. Interspecific competition occurs amongst individuals of different species for one or a few of the resources they require. The way I remember that interspecific competition is between members of different species is when I think of inter, I think of international flights and the fact that they go between different countries. Another important thing to point out here is that because they are different species, they normally only compete for one resource or a few resources. So in this example here, a cheetah is competing with a lion, and this is most likely to be over either food or meat or territory. They won't be fighting over mates as they are different species. On the other hand, intraspecific competition occurs amongst individuals of the same species and is for all resources required, as any individuals will have the same niche. They will all have the same requirements for food, shelter, mates, and territory, so they will compete for all of these resources with one another. Now, a really common question is which of these two types of competition is more intense? Well, if we compare these definitions side by side, apart from the fact that inters between different species and intras between members of the same species, the big difference is that during interspecific competition, they only compete for one or a few resources, whereas in intraspecific competition, they compete for all of the same resources. Therefore, intraspecific competition is more intense as it's because between members of the same species and it's for all of the same resources that they require. So therefore, intraspecific is more intense than interspecific. So let's try some final quick questions on what we've covered so far to check our knowledge before we finish. So pause the video here and try these questions, either by saying the answer out loud or writing them down. And when you're ready, play the video and we will go through the answers. Okay, so let's run through our answers. Number 1 asks, under what conditions will competition between organisms occur? The answer for this is if resources are in short supply. Question number 2 asks which type of competition occurs between members of the same species for all resources they require. The answer for this is intraspecific. Number 3 asks which type of competition occurs between members of different species for one or a few of the resources they require is interspecific. And number 4 asks which type of competition is more intense and why. That would be intraspecific, as it's between members of the same species for all resources they require, whereas interspecific competition is only for one or a few resources. So that is us finished learning about ecosystems. I hope you're now confident about giving definitions of terms related to ecosystems, describing what a niche is, interpreting and constructing food chains and food webs, and explaining the differences between the two types of competition. This was a difficult topic with a lot of new information and definitions, so please feel free to go back and watch parts of the video again in future if you need a refresher on any of it. I would also highly suggest you create flashcards on all of the definitions discussed in this video so that you can practice the definitions, because they're really, really important and it's really difficult to learn them unless you use some form of revision aid like flashcards. Thank you once again for listening.